Thomas Hartwell had built his empire from nothing, a construction business that grew from a single truck to a fleet of equipment worth millions. At 42, his weathered hands and steel-gray eyes told the story of a man who'd clawed his way up from poverty through sheer determination and calculated ruthlessness. He'd learned early that mercy was weakness, and weakness was death in his world. His wife of 18 years, Jennifer, had once admired that very quality. She'd met him when he was just a foreman with calloused hands and big dreams. Back then, she was a dental hygienist with honey blonde hair and a laugh that could light up a room. They'd built something together, 2 children, a sprawling house in the suburbs, and what everyone assumed was the perfect American dream. But perfection, Thomas had learned, was an illusion. The first crack appeared 6 months ago during their daughter Lucy's 16th birthday party. Thomas had noticed how Jennifer's phone would buzz constantly, how she'd disappear to answer calls, claiming they were from her book club or yoga instructor. He watched her carefully, the way he watched subcontractors who might be skimming materials. Something was off. "Dad, you're staring again," 17-year-old Kyle had said that night, catching his father's intense gaze following Jennifer across the backyard. "Just making sure everything's running smoothly," Thomas had replied, but his son's uncomfortable expression told him the boy had noticed the tension too. Lucy, bubbly and trusting at 16, remained oblivious to the storm brewing. She adored both parents equally, splitting her time between helping Thomas at construction sites and shopping with Jennifer. She had her mother's laugh, but her father's sharp intelligence, a dangerous combination that made her Thomas's secret favorite. The second crack came when Thomas installed tracking software on the family computers. 20 years in construction had taught him to verify everything, trust nothing, and always have an exit strategy. What he found in Jennifer's browsing history and deleted emails painted a picture that made his blood run cold. Her lover wasn't some random affair. It was Dr. Miguel Torres, Lucy's pediatrician, a man Thomas had shaken hands with, invited to barbecues, trusted with his daughter's health. The timestamps showed the affair had been going on for over a year, with detailed plans and intimate messages that made Thomas's jaw clench with barely contained rage. But Thomas Hartwell hadn't survived the cutthroat construction world by acting on impulse. He was a planner, a strategist. If Jennifer wanted to play games, he'd make sure he won, permanently. "You seem distant lately," Jennifer had said one evening, curled up beside him in bed. Her touch felt like poison on his skin, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Just work stress. The Morrison project is behind schedule," he lied smoothly. In reality, he'd been consulting with the best divorce attorney in the state, forensic accountants, and private investigators. If Jennifer thought she could destroy his family and walk away with half his life's work, she was about to learn exactly who she'd married. "Maybe we should take a family vacation, get away from everything," she suggested, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. Thomas smiled in the darkness. "Actually, that's not a bad idea. How about the cabin? Haven't been up there in months." The cabin? His grandfather's old hunting lodge in the mountains, remote and isolated. The place where Thomas had learned to shoot, to hunt, to understand that sometimes violence was the only solution to certain problems. Where he decided, even as a boy, that he would never be weak like his father, a man who'd let life beat him down until he drank himself to death. The kids would love that, Jennifer agreed. And Thomas could practically hear the relief in her voice, probably thinking a family trip would throw him off the scent. 3 weeks later, Thomas received the call that would change everything. Thomas was reviewing blueprints in his office when his phone rang with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted, electronic, like something from a nightmare. "Your cabin now. The people your son brought up." The line went dead. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed his keys and ran for his truck. The cabin was 90 minutes away on a good day, but he'd make it in 60. Something in that voice, cold, threatening, triggered every protective instinct he developed over 4 decades of hard living. His mind raced as he pushed the speedometer past 100 mph. Kyle had asked to take some friends to the cabin last weekend. Thomas had said yes, thinking it would be good for the boy to have some independence. But what friends? And why did that voice sound so ominous? The winding mountain roads blurred past as fragments of memory surfaced. Kyle had been acting strange lately, jumpy, secretive, avoiding eye contact. Jennifer had brushed it off as typical teenage behavior, but Thomas had noticed the boy's hand shaking when he thought no one was looking. There were also phone calls Kyle would take outside, conversations that stopped abruptly when anyone approached. 45 minutes later, Thomas's truck skidded to a halt in front of the cabin. His heart hammered when he saw Jennifer's car already there, along with Kyle standing beside her, both of them positioned like guards in front of the cabin door. "Dad, you can't!" Kyle cried out as Thomas approached, his voice cracking with desperation. "They're not human!" Jennifer screamed, her face pale with terror. But there was something else in her expression. Guilt, shame, and fear that went beyond whatever was happening inside. "They made us watch them do it," Jennifer continued. And those words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Lucy, his sweet, innocent Lucy. "Get out of my way," Thomas growled. But Kyle stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please, you don't understand." Thomas didn't hesitate. He'd taught his son that respect was earned through strength, and right now, Kyle was standing between him and Lucy. He shoved the boy aside with enough force to send him sprawling, then kicked in the cabin door with a sound like thunder. The scene inside would haunt him forever. Lucy sat in the corner, alive, but changed. Her clothes were intact, but her eyes, those bright, trusting eyes, were hollow, distant. Around her were 3 men Thomas had never seen before, all wearing identical masks that looked almost reptilian. But what made his blood freeze wasn't their appearance. It was the video equipment set up around the room, the cameras, the lights, and on one of the laptops, a live stream with hundreds of viewers and chat messages scrolling by in real time. Thomas's vision turned red. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the hunting rifle from its mount on the wall and chambered around. The masked figures turned toward him, but there was no fear in their movements, only cold calculation. "Step away from my daughter," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. That's when he noticed the worst detail of all. Kyle's backpack in the corner, money scattered around it, and his son's voice from outside yelling something about payment and schedules. His own son had sold Lucy to these monsters. The police arrived 20 minutes after Thomas's call, but by then, the masked men had vanished like smoke. The video equipment remained, along with enough evidence to paint a picture that made even the hardened detectives sick. What they found on the computers wasn't just local. This was part of a sophisticated network that had been operating for years. Detective Rosa Martinez, a 15-year veteran with kind eyes and steel determination, took Thomas aside while the crime scene team worked. "Mr. Hartwell, I need to ask some difficult questions," she said gently. "Did you know your son was involved in this?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm still processing that information. The money we found suggests he was paid to bring your daughter here. The digital evidence shows this wasn't the first time he'd made contact with these individuals." Through the cabin window, Thomas watched Kyle sitting in a police car, no longer crying. The boy's face had gone blank, almost defiant. Jennifer paced nearby, arguing with another officer about lawyers and constitutional rights. Not for Lucy, but for Kyle. "What about my wife?" Thomas asked. Detective Martinez consulted her notes. "According to the preliminary interviews, she and your son arrived here together about an hour before you did. She claims she came to stop what was happening, but she hesitated." "But what, Mr. Hartwell? We found text messages between your wife and your son going back weeks. She knew what he was planning." The betrayal hit him like a sledgehammer. Not just Kyle's greed and twisted thinking, but Jennifer's willing participation. His wife, the mother of his children, had helped orchestrate Lucy's destruction. "There's more," Martinez continued. "We believe your wife's relationship with Dr. Torres is connected to this network. He's been under federal investigation for 3 months. Thomas felt something cold and final settle in his chest. The rage was there, burning like acid, but underneath it was the calculating mind that had built his empire from nothing. Jennifer and Kyle had declared war on his family. They'd used Lucy as a weapon against him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Detective Martinez," Thomas said quietly, "I want to be very clear about something. I will cooperate fully with your investigation. I want these animals caught and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Hartwell," she replied. "But I also want you to understand that if the legal system fails my daughter, if these people walk free on technicalities or plea bargains, I will handle this matter myself." Martinez studied his face for a long moment. "Mr. Hartwell, I can't." "I'm not asking for your permission," Thomas interrupted. "I'm telling you that my daughter's safety and justice come before everything else. Everything." Later that night, as Lucy slept heavily under sedation at the hospital, Thomas sat in his truck outside their house. Kyle was in juvenile detention pending charges. Jennifer was staying at her sister's place, claiming she needed space to process what had happened. But Thomas knew the truth. She was with Torres, probably planning their next move, maybe even preparing to flee the state. They thought they'd won something by destroying Lucy, thought they'd broken him. They were about to learn the difference between hurting Thomas Hartwell and making him their enemy. He pulled out his phone and made a call to Billy Rohr, an old friend from his army days who now ran a very specialized consulting business. "Billy, it's Thomas. Remember that favor you owe me? I'm ready to collect." 2 weeks after the cabin incident, Thomas had transformed from grieving father to meticulous hunter. His construction business continued running smoothly. He'd built it to function without constant oversight. While he focused entirely on gathering intelligence about the network that had targeted Lucy, Billy Rohr proved invaluable. The grizzled ex-Special Forces operator had spent the last decade in the gray areas between legal and necessary, and his contacts ran deep in both law enforcement and less savory circles. "Your boy Kyle wasn't recruited randomly," Billy explained during their meeting at a diner outside town. "This Torres has been grooming families for years. Targets kids from wealthy families, usually ones with marital problems. Classic predator playbook." Thomas stirred his coffee methodically. "How many families?" "At least 12 that we can confirm. The feds are building a RICO case, but that'll take years. These people know how to cover their tracks. And my wife," Billy's expression darkened. "She's been feeding Torres information about Lucy for over a year. Doctor visits, school schedules, psychological evaluations, everything he needed to assess her as a target." The revelation hit Thomas like ice water. Jennifer hadn't just betrayed their marriage, She'd actively participated in targeting their daughter. The woman he'd shared a bed with for 18 years had been planning Lucy's destruction while making breakfast and asking about his day. "There's something else," Billy continued. "Torres has been recording everything. Not just the kids, the parents too. Blackmail material. Your wife and son are both on those recordings. And from what my source tells me, they're not victims." Thomas's hand tightened on his coffee cup until his knuckles went white. "Where are these recordings?" "That's where it gets interesting. Torres keeps everything on encrypted servers, but he's paranoid about digital evidence. The real insurance policies, the ones that could destroy judges, politicians, other high-profile clients, those are kept on physical drives in a safe house." Billy slid a piece of paper across the table. "Address is on there. But Thomas, this place isn't just a storage facility. It's operational, active." Thomas studied the address, memorizing it. "How many others like Lucy right now?" 3 kids that we know of. Youngest is 14. Something cold and final settled in Thomas's chest. The legal system was too slow, too burdened with procedures and constitutional protections that these monsters exploited. While lawyers argued about search warrants and due process, children were being destroyed. "I need blueprints, security details, patrol schedules," Thomas said quietly. "Already working on it," Billy replied. "But Tom, once you cross this line, you can't go back. I crossed it the moment they touched my daughter." That evening, Thomas visited Lucy at the private psychiatric facility where she was recovering. She was awake, alert, but there was a hollowness in her eyes that cut him deeper than any physical wound. "Daddy," she said softly when he entered her room. "Hey, sweetheart." He sat beside her bed, careful not to move too quickly. The doctors had warned him that sudden movements could trigger panic attacks. "I trusted Kyle," she whispered. "He said we were just going to hang out with his friends. I thought it would be fun." Thomas felt his hands clenching into fists, but kept his voice gentle. "None of this is your fault, Lucy. Not one bit. Mom keeps calling. She wants to visit." But Lucy's voice trailed off. "But what, honey?" She knew, didn't she? About Kyle, about what he was planning. Lucy's intelligence, her father's sharp perception, had put the pieces together despite her trauma. Thomas had never lied to his daughter, and he wouldn't start now. Yes, she knew. Lucy nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "I don't want to see her." "You don't have to see anyone you don't want to see. Ever." "What about Kyle?" Thomas met his daughter's eyes and saw something there that reminded him of himself at her age, the moment when innocence died and hardness began. Kyle made his choice. He chose money over family, over you. Will they go to prison? Some of them will. Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. Others won't. Lucy studied his face for a long moment. Because the system doesn't always work. That's right. What happens to people the system can't handle? Thomas saw his own ruthless nature reflected in his daughter's eyes and felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. Sometimes, sweetheart, families have to handle their own problems. Lucy nodded once, then settled back against her pillows. I want to come home soon. Soon, Thomas promised. And when you do, everything will be different. Better. As he drove home that night, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from Billy. Package delivered. Construction begins tomorrow. The package contained everything he needed. Blueprints, guard schedules, security camera locations, and detailed intelligence on the safe house's operations. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of justice that the courts couldn't provide. But first, he had one more visit to make. Thomas found Dr. Miguel Torres exactly where Billy's intelligence had predicted, at a high-end restaurant downtown, dining with Jennifer. Through the window, he watched his wife of 18 years laugh at something Torres said, her hand covering his across the table. The sight should have brought rage, but instead, Thomas felt only cold clarity. Jennifer looked relaxed, happy even, just 2 weeks after their daughter's traumatic ordeal. She'd traded in her family for a predator who sold children, and she seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. Thomas waited until they left the restaurant, following Torres's Mercedes at a careful distance. The doctor lived in an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place where concerned citizens minded their own business, and security cameras were mostly for show. At 2 a.m., Thomas let himself into Torres's house through the garage. Billy's contacts had provided security codes along with everything else. He moved through the darkened rooms like a ghost, his construction worker's knowledge of building layouts serving him well. Torres slept alone. Jennifer was apparently maintaining the pretense of separation while the legal proceedings continued. Thomas stood beside the bed for a long moment, studying the man who had orchestrated his family's destruction. Torres was smaller than he'd appeared in the office, soft where Thomas was hard, weak where Thomas was strong. This pathetic creature had destroyed Lucy's innocence and turned Kyle into a monster. He had convinced Jennifer to betray her own daughter. Thomas pressed a cloth soaked in chloroform over Torres's mouth and nose, holding it until the man went limp. Then he loaded him into the construction van parked in the garage and drove to a special location Billy had prepared, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. When Torres woke up, he was chained to a chair in the center of an empty room. Construction lights hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that made everything look like a crime scene, which Thomas reflected it was about to become. "Mr. Hartwell," Torres said, his voice surprisingly steady. "This is highly irregular." "So is selling children," Thomas replied, settling into a chair across from him. "Let's talk about Lucy." "I have no idea what you're referring to. I'm Lucy's pediatrician. If someone has made allegations..." Thomas pulled out his phone and played a video Billy had obtained from the federal investigation. Torres's voice was clear as he discussed pricing and scheduling with someone off camera. "The blonde one, the Hartwell girl. She's perfect, naive, trusting, isolated. Her brothers already agreed to the arrangement." Torres's face went pale as his own words played back. "That's taken out of context. It's not what it sounds like, really." Thomas stood up and walked slowly around the chair. "Because it sounds like you and my wife spent months planning to destroy my daughter. It sounds like you turned my son into a pimp. Your wife came to me. She was the one who suggested..." "Suggested what?" Torres's composure finally cracked. "She said you were abusive, that you beat her, that you threatened the children. She wanted protection, and the only way I could help was if we had leverage against you." Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. And selling Lucy to be raped on camera was protection. It wasn't supposed to go that far. The plan was just photographs, something to ensure you couldn't hurt Jennifer in the divorce. But then you saw an opportunity to make money. Torres said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas said, returning to his chair. "You're going to tell me everything. Every client, every victim, every collaborator. You're going to give me access to all your files, all your recordings, all your insurance policies." "I can't do that. These people would kill me." "Miguel," Thomas said softly, "look around. You think they're scarier than I am?" For the next 4 hours, Torres talked. He revealed a network that reached into law enforcement, politics, and high society. Judges who looked the other way in exchange for private screenings. Politicians who received custom content featuring specific types of children. Wealthy business owners who paid premium prices for exclusive access. Most shocking of all were the recordings Torres kept of his adult collaborators, including extensive footage of Jennifer and Kyle discussing Lucy's psychological profile, her schedule, her vulnerabilities. "She was so eager," Torres whispered, his voice broken from hours of confession. "Your wife? She provided details I never would have thought to ask for. Lucy's favorite foods, her fears, what would make her compliant." Thomas felt something snap inside his chest, the last restraint holding back 18 years of trust and love. Jennifer hadn't just betrayed him. She'd actively participated in planning their daughter's destruction with the enthusiasm of a true believer. "One more question," Thomas said. "The other children currently in your network, where are they?" Torres gave him 3 addresses, whimpering as he spoke. Thomas stood up and walked to a workbench where Billy had left certain tools. "Thank you for your cooperation, Miguel. You've been very helpful. What happens now? Do I go to prison?" Thomas picked up a hammer and tested its weight. "No, Miguel, you don't." 20 minutes later, Thomas made a phone call to Billy. "Package ready for disposal. Begin Phase 2. Phase 2 was already in motion. While Thomas had been interrogating Torres, Billy's team had been systematically hitting the safe houses, rescuing the children, and securing the evidence. But that was just the beginning. The real justice was about to begin. By dawn, Billy's team had extracted all 3 children from Torres's network and delivered enough evidence to federal authorities to dismantle the entire operation. But Thomas wasn't interested in legal victories anymore. He wanted biblical justice. Jennifer arrived at what used to be their family home at 8 a.m., using her key as if nothing had changed. She probably expected to find Thomas at work and the house empty. Instead, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a tablet displaying security footage from Torres's house. "Thomas, what are you doing here? I thought you were staying at the hotel." While she stopped speaking when she saw the tablet screen, her face went white as she watched herself and Torres discussing Lucy's psychological evaluation from the previous month. "Sit down, Jennifer," Thomas said without looking up. "I can explain." "Sit down." The tone of his voice, cold, final, deadly, made her obey instinctively. She'd heard him use that voice with subcontractors who tried to cheat him, with competitors who threatened his business. She'd never had it directed at her. "Miguel's missing," she said carefully. "I know the police think he might have fled the country. There was evidence of federal investigations, money laundering." "Jennifer." Thomas finally looked at her, and she recoiled from what she saw in his eyes. "I have recordings of you planning our daughter's assault. I have financial records showing payments you received. I have video of you laughing about it afterward." Jennifer's hand flew to her throat. We never meant for it to go that far. It was supposed to be just pictures, just something to help with the divorce." "Help with the divorce by destroying Lucy?" Thomas repeated. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. You're so controlling, so demanding. I needed something to ensure you couldn't take the children away from me." Thomas stood up slowly. "You were worried I might take the children away from you, so you decided to have Lucy sexually assaulted on camera. It wasn't supposed to happen. Miguel promised it would just be photographs, just evidence of inappropriate behavior that we could say was your fault." The confession hung between them like poison. Jennifer realized too late what she'd admitted. My fault, Thomas repeated. You were going to claim I abused Lucy. You're so cold, Thomas. So harsh with the children. People would have believed it. Thomas walked around the table toward her, and Jennifer instinctively pressed back in her chair. And Kyle, what was his excuse? Kyle needed money for college. You've always been so tight with money, so controlling about what he could and couldn't do. Miguel offered him $50,000. $50,000 to deliver his sister to be raped. It wasn't rape. Miguel said they were just going to take pictures, maybe videos of her changing clothes. Nothing violent. Nothing that would actually hurt her. Thomas grabbed Jennifer by the throat. Not squeezing, just holding her in place while he spoke. You sold our daughter to a pedophile network. You helped plan every detail. You took money for it. And when it went wrong, you stood outside that cabin trying to protect the monsters instead of her. I was trying to protect Kyle. You were protecting your investment. Thomas released her and stepped back. Jennifer gasped and rubbed her throat, but there were no marks. He was too controlled for that. Here's what's going to happen, Thomas said. You're going to disappear tonight. You're going to empty your bank accounts, get in your car, and drive away from here. You'll never contact Lucy again. Never contact me again. Never set foot in this state again. You can't make me. If you're still here tomorrow morning, I'll release every recording I have to social media. Your family, your coworkers, your friends, everyone will know exactly what you are, how you sold your own daughter for money. Jennifer's face crumpled. Thomas, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this. We're a family. We were a family. Then you destroyed it for money and revenge. What about Kyle? He's still my son. Thomas's expression didn't change. Kyle made his choice. He's 17 years old enough to understand the consequences of his actions, old enough to know that selling his sister makes him an enemy. He's your son too. Not anymore. The finality in Thomas's voice seemed to break something in Jennifer. She started crying. Not the manipulative tears she'd used during their marriage, but genuine sobs of someone who finally understood the magnitude of what she'd lost. You can't just cut us out of your life. Lucy needs her mother, needs her brother. Lucy needs to heal. She needs to know she's safe. She can't do that with either of you in her life. Thomas walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood where they'd raised their children, where Lucy had played in the backyard, where Kyle had learned to ride a bike. All of it contaminated now by what Jennifer and Kyle had done. You have 12 hours, he said without turning around. Use them wisely. After Jennifer left, Thomas sat alone in the empty house for a long time. In 12 hours, he'd completed the first phase of his justice. Torres was dead and disposed of. The network was dismantled. The other children were safe. But this was just the beginning. Kyle was still in juvenile detention, still believing he could bargain his way out of consequences, still thinking his father might eventually forgive him. Kyle was about to learn how wrong he was. Thomas waited 3 months before visiting Kyle in juvenile detention, long enough for the boy to grow comfortable, to believe that his father's silence meant forgiveness was possible, long enough for Kyle to start planning his future, probably assuming he'd serve minimal time and then rebuild his relationship with his family. The visiting room was sterile and depressing, with plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick. Kyle had lost weight, but he'd also lost the haunted look he'd worn immediately after the cabin incident. Now, he looked almost cocky, like someone who'd figured out how to work the system. "Dad," Kyle said as Thomas sat down across from him. "Boss." I wasn't sure you'd come. It took me a while to decide what I wanted to say to you. Kyle leaned forward eagerly. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I need you to understand the situation I was in. Mom was filling my head with all this stuff about you, about how you were abusive and controlling. Miguel convinced me that we were protecting Lucy from you. Thomas studied his son's face, the earnest expression, the practiced sincerity. Kyle had been rehearsing this speech for months, probably with a public defender who'd coached him on expressing remorse and accepting responsibility. Go on, Thomas said. The plan was never to hurt Lucy. Never. Miguel promised it would just be pictures, just evidence we could use if you tried to take us away from Mom in the divorce. When those other guys showed up, when it turned into something else, I tried to stop it. That's why I called you. You called me? Kyle blinked, momentarily confused. Someone did. I thought maybe Mom called you, or one of the neighbors heard something and I received that call from an unknown number, electronic voice distortion. Someone who knew exactly what was happening and wanted me to find it. The color drained from Kyle's face as he realized his mistake. I don't know anything about that. Of course you do. You orchestrated the whole thing. You wanted me to find Lucy like that. Wanted me to see her destroyed. Wanted me to know that you'd done it. That's not true. The financial records show you received payments from Torres going back 8 months. Not one payment, Kyle. 8 months of regular deposits. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision influenced by your mother. Kyle's composure finally cracked. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Do you know what it's like being your son? Nothing's ever good enough. Nothing I do is right. You've been waiting my whole life for me to fail. So, you decided to destroy your sister instead of proving me wrong. I wanted to hurt you the way you hurt me. Every day with your criticism and your impossibly high standards and your constant disappointment. There it was. The truth Thomas had suspected, but hoped he was wrong about. Kyle hadn't been manipulated or pressured. He'd been motivated by pure malice, by a desire to inflict the maximum possible damage on his father through the one person Thomas loved unconditionally. How much did they pay you to make that call? Thomas asked quietly. Kyle stared at him for a long moment, then laughed, a bitter sound that had no warmth in it. 50,000 for delivery, another 25 for the performance when you showed up. They wanted you to see everything, wanted you to know your perfect little princess had been ruined, and you were happy to provide that service. I wanted you to suffer the way you made me suffer. Thomas nodded slowly. I see. So, what happens now? You lecture me about responsibility. You threaten to cut me off financially. You've already done that. You've already made it clear that Lucy's your favorite, that I'll never measure up to your expectations. Kyle, Thomas said, standing up. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I'm listening. You are no longer my son. You are no longer Lucy's brother. You are no longer part of our family in any way. Kyle's cocky expression faltered. Dad, when you turn 18 in 3 months, you'll be transferred to adult prison. You'll serve your full sentence with no help from me, no lawyers, no appeals, no commissary money, nothing. You can't just abandon me. When you get out, if you get out, you'll be completely on your own. No family connections, no financial support, no second chances. You can't just throw me away. You threw yourself away when you sold Lucy. You stopped being my son the moment you took money to destroy her. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone deserves forgiveness. Thomas looked at his former son for the last time, memorizing the face so he'd recognize it if Kyle ever tried to contact Lucy in the future. Some mistakes can't be forgiven. Kyle, some betrayals are permanent. What about Mom? She was part of this too. Your mother is gone. She won't be coming back. Gone where? Thomas didn't answer. He simply turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Kyle standing alone in the visiting room. Behind him, he heard his former son screaming threats, promises, desperate pleas for another chance. Thomas never looked back. 6 months later, Thomas sold the family house and moved with Lucy to a ranch property 2 hours outside the city. The new house was smaller, but surrounded by 40 acres of privacy, with clear sight lines in every direction and security measures that would make a paranoid millionaire proud. Lucy had started speaking again after months of silence. But she was different now. Harder, more observant, less trusting. She'd inherited her father's ability to read people, to spot deception and weakness. The trauma had aged her in ways that broke Thomas's heart, but it had also made her stronger. "Any word from Kyle?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "He'll be transferred to adult prison next month," Thomas replied. "After that, he's on his own." "Good." Lucy's voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of the warmth she used to show when talking about her brother. "What about Mom?" Thomas had been dreading this question for months. "Your mother left the state. She won't be coming back." "Did you kill her?" The blunt question hung between them in the evening air. Lucy watched her father's face carefully, and Thomas saw his own calculating nature reflected in her eyes. "Would it bother you if I had?" Lucy considered this for a long moment. "She helped plan what happened to me. She took money for it. She stood outside that cabin trying to protect them instead of me." "That's right." "Then no, it wouldn't bother me." Thomas felt a mixture of pride and sorrow at his daughter's response. She'd learned the most important lesson he could teach her, that family was defined by loyalty, not blood, and that some betrayals could never be forgiven. "Your mother is alive," he said finally, "but she's not our family anymore. Like Kyle. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn purple and gold. In the distance, Thomas could see the lights of the new security system he'd installed, motion sensors, cameras, and other measures to ensure they were never surprised again. "Dad," Lucy said eventually. "Yeah? I want to learn to shoot." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "I think that's a good idea. And I want to know how to spot liars. I can teach you that too. And I want to understand how you found those men, how you made them pay for what they did." Thomas turned to look at his daughter. Really? Look at her. She was 17 now, but her eyes held depths that most adults never reached. The trauma had burned away her innocence, but it had also revealed the steel underneath. He realized, at that moment, this was the start of a new chapter, not just for Lucy, but for both of them. "That's a longer conversation," he said carefully. "I have time. Some knowledge comes with responsibilities, Lucy. Once you know certain things, you can't unknow them. I already know what people are capable of. I've seen it firsthand." Thomas nodded slowly. "In that case, we'll start tomorrow." Over the following months, Thomas taught Lucy everything he'd learned about justice, about protecting what mattered, about the difference between legal and right. He showed her how to research targets, how to gather intelligence, and how to plan operations that left no traces. She learned quickly, too quickly sometimes. Her questions grew more sophisticated, her suggestions more ruthless. When she asked about explosives, about surveillance equipment, about ways to make people disappear permanently, Thomas realized he was raising a weapon. But after what she'd endured, after what their family had survived, maybe that was exactly what the world needed. 2 years after the cabin incident, Thomas received a phone call that changed everything. Detective Martinez, now a close friend and occasional consultant on matters requiring discretion, had troubling news. "Kyle's been released," she said without preamble. "Early parole for good behavior." Thomas felt that familiar cold settling in his chest. Where is he? That's the problem. He violated parole conditions within 24 hours, disappeared completely. "But Tom, we found evidence he's been in contact with some very dangerous people." "What kind of people?" "The kind who specialize in revenge for hire. The kind who know you were responsible for dismantling Torres's network." That evening, Thomas called a family meeting, which now consisted of just him and Lucy. At 19, she'd grown into a formidable young woman who split her time between studying criminal justice and what she euphemistically called research projects for her father's consulting business. "Kyle's out," Thomas said simply. Lucy looked up from the surveillance reports she'd been reviewing. "How long before he makes his move?" "Unknown, but we need to assume he's coming." "Good," Lucy said, and Thomas heard his own ruthlessness in her voice. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 2 years." They spent the next 3 hours planning. Lucy had ideas that impressed even Thomas with their thoroughness and brutality. She'd been thinking about Kyle for a long time, working through scenarios and contingencies with the patience of a natural predator. "He'll try to get to me first," she said, spreading blueprints across the kitchen table. "He knows that's the way to hurt you most, which is why you're not going to be available for targeting." Lucy smiled, an expression that would have terrified her former mother and brother. "Oh, I'll be available, but it'll be a trap." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Lucy enrolled in night classes at the community college, establishing a predictable routine that Kyle could observe and plan around. But what Kyle wouldn't know was that Lucy had been training with Billy Rohr for 18 months, learning everything an ex-Special Forces operator could teach about close combat, weapons handling, and psychological warfare. The classroom where Lucy attended her supposed accounting class was actually a carefully constructed kill box with multiple exit routes, concealed weapons, and surveillance equipment that would record everything for legal purposes. Kyle took the bait 3 weeks later. He waited until Lucy was walking to her car after class, probably planning to grab her in the parking lot where there were few witnesses. But as he approached from behind, Lucy spun around with fluid grace and put a knife to his throat before he could react. "Hello, brother," she said softly. Kyle froze, his eyes going wide as he realized the trap he'd walked into. Around the parking lot, Thomas's people emerged from concealment. Billy Rohr and 3 of his associates, all armed and positioned to prevent escape. "Lucy," Kyle whispered, "you don't understand. I've changed. I want to make things right." "Really?" Lucy pressed the knife a little deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. "Is that why you've been casing our house for the past week? Is that why you've been asking questions about Dad's business associates? I just wanted to talk to you. You wanted to finish what you started at the cabin." Thomas stepped out of the shadows, his face impassive as he looked at the boy who used to be his son. Kyle was 20 now, but prison had made him harder, more desperate. There was a wildness in his eyes that suggested he'd learned new forms of violence during his incarceration. "Kyle," Thomas said simply. Dad. Kyle's voice was steady despite the knife at his throat. I know you hate me. I know you'll probably kill me. But before you do, I want you to know something. I'm listening. It was worth it. Destroying Lucy, destroying our family, watching you suffer, it was all worth it because for the first time in my life, I had power over you. Lucy looked up at her father, and Thomas saw the question in her eyes. He nodded once. Lucy's hand moved with surgical precision, the blade sliding between Kyle's ribs and into his heart. He was dead before he hit the ground, his face locked in an expression of surprise. Well done, Thomas said, and meant it. Billy's team moved efficiently to clean up the scene while Thomas and Lucy stood over Kyle's body. There was no grief, no regret, no sense of loss. Kyle had stopped being family the moment he chose money over loyalty. This was simply the completion of justice that had been delayed too long. What happens now? Lucy asked. Now we go home, Thomas replied, and we continue the work. The work was a growing consulting business that specialized in problems the legal system couldn't handle. Families who'd been failed by courts and law enforcement came to Thomas and Lucy with their desperate situations, and the father-daughter team provided permanent solutions. They were selective, taking only cases where the evidence was overwhelming and the stakes were life or death. But in a world where monsters hid behind legal technicalities and constitutional protections, Thomas and Lucy Hartwell provided something precious: absolute justice. As they drove home that night, Lucy asked the question that had been on her mind for months. Do you ever regret how we handle Mom? Thomas considered this carefully. Your mother made her choice when she decided to sell you for money. Everything that happened after that was just consequences. But do you regret it? No, Thomas said simply. Some people can't be redeemed, Lucy. Some people choose to be monsters. When that happens, the only question is whether you're strong enough to do what needs to be done. Lucy nodded, satisfied with the answer. She'd learned the most important lesson Thomas could teach her, that strength without mercy was the only way to protect what mattered. In the rearview mirror, the lights of the city faded behind them. Somewhere out there were other families facing impossible choices, other children who needed protection from predators the system couldn't touch. Thomas and Lucy Hartwell would be ready for them. After all, justice was a family business.